Chapter 2: The Mysterious Figurines. As Nancy bounded around the front of her car, the traffic light changed. The automobile in the right lane started to round the corner, cutting off her dash to the curb. By the time she reached the sidewalk, the man she was chasing had disappeared. Bess pulled the convertible to the curb and parked. She watched as Nancy dodged in and out of stores, looking for the suspect. Finally, the young sleuth returned to her car. "That man certainly disappeared suddenly," she said, climbing in. "I'll bet he did it on purpose," Bess declared. "Maybe. Anyway, I still intend to find him," Nancy said with determination. Bess knew she would, too. Throughout their long friendship, nothing had ever deterred Nancy from solving a mystery. The young sleuth was greatly admired in River Heights because of her unusual ability to track down elusive clues, as well as for her courage and quick-wittedness. Nancy's reputation as a detective went back to the time when her father, a prominent lawyer, had turned over to his daughter the case known as the Secret of the Old Clock. Since then, Nancy had been engaged in countless other adventures. Only recently she had finished working on a strange circus intrigue, the ringmaster's secret. Now she was eager to solve the Fontaines mystery. Nancy chided herself for having let the first good lead in the case slip through her fingers. Bess, who was driving now, warned Nancy to be careful. "The whole thing sounds terribly dangerous to me," she said. "I had no idea when I asked you to help Helene that you were going to become involved in an international crisis." Nancy laughed. "Don't worry," she said. "I promise to stick to the United States." "Yes, but that won't necessarily keep you safe," said Bess, as she pulled up in front of her house. She alighted and said she would see Nancy the next day. Nancy headed for her own home, a large, spacious dwelling which stood back some distance from an attractive street lined with old sycamore trees. She pulled into the winding drive, bordered with flower beds, and parked the car. As she hurried up the flagstone walk to the kitchen door, Hannah Gruen, the Drews' housekeeper, came out to meet her. Nancy embraced the pleasant-faced woman who had lived with Nancy and her father since Mrs. Drew's death many years before. There was a sharp bark as Nancy's little terrier, Togo, came bounding toward his mistress. She caught him up in her arms and said with a laugh, "Did you take good care of Hannah and Dad while I was away?" Turning to the housekeeper, she asked, "How is everything?" "Just fine." "Is Dad home?" "Not yet," Hannah replied, "but he'll be here to dinner. Oh, here he comes now." Carson Drew pulled into the driveway in his own car, a late-model sedan. He stepped out and Nancy ran forward to greet him. Mr. Drew was a tall, handsome man. Nancy loved his firm but kind expression, the twinkle in his eyes, and his keen mind. Hannah had dinner ready, and the three sat down to enjoy the delicious meal. After Nancy had told them about her trip to New York, she broached the subject of the Fontaines and their problem. "It sounds very serious," Mr. Drew remarked. "I'd rather you did nothing about the case until I consult government authorities on the subject. I'm flying down to Washington this evening." Nancy nodded. "Will it be all right for me to search for that mysterious man who was on the plane?" "All right," the lawyer conceded. "But be careful. If you think it's necessary to have him questioned, get the police." After dinner, Nancy began telephoning local hotels and guest houses. But no one known to be from Centrovia was registered at any of them. At 9 o'clock, a taxi came to take Mr. Drew to the airport. He had been gone only a few minutes when the doorbell rang. Nancy answered it. "Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Boyd?" she said, admitting a slender, gray-haired woman who was red-faced and seemed very much upset. "I want to speak to your father right away, Nancy." "I'm sorry, but he's not at home. Can I do anything for you?" "Well, I don't know," Mrs. Boyd answered, "but I'll tell you what's on my mind anyway." Nancy led the distraught woman into the living room, where she settled down in a comfortable chair with a sigh. "It's about Mr. Howard down at the jewelry store," she said. "I think I ought to sue him." Nancy waited politely for the woman to proceed. It was several seconds before Mrs. Boyd became calm enough to continue. "This morning I was in the store and saw a bisque figurine that appealed to me. It was priced pretty high, but I bought it. After I got home, what do you think? There was a long crack in the little statue. I'll show it to you." From a large handbag, she lifted out a dainty dancing girl figurine. At first glance, the crack was not noticeable, but upon close inspection, Nancy could see it. The flaw ran along a fold in the skirt. "When I saw it," said Mrs. Boyd, "I took the piece right back to Mr. Howard. And that man, he wouldn't do a thing about it. He didn't come right out and say so, but he inferred that I had damaged the statue after I left the store. The idea! Moreover, he refused to return my money. Now, what do you think, Nancy? Shouldn't I sue him?" The young detective felt rather uncomfortable. She certainly wanted to hear Mr. Howard's side of the case before answering the question. "Mrs. Boyd," Nancy said, "I think my father will have to decide whether or not you should sue Mr. Howard. But in the meantime, suppose I take the statue down to the store and talk to him. Perhaps then we can arrive at a satisfactory solution of the matter." "Oh, thank you, my dear," said Mrs. Boyd gratefully as she rose to leave. "That would be fine. Maybe you can talk some sense into Mr. Howard." "I'll certainly do my best," Nancy promised, as she accompanied the visitor to the door. The next morning, Nancy arrived at the jewelry store soon after it opened. Mr. Howard, whom she had known for several years, was standing behind a counter near the door. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "What can I do for you today?" Nancy went directly to the point, showing him the figurine and telling of Mrs. Boyd's visit to the Drew home. Mr. Howard looked annoyed, then said, "I didn't feel that the crack was bad enough for me to take the figurine back." "Perhaps not," said Nancy, "but it does look as if the figurine had been tampered with, and I'm sure Mrs. Boyd didn't do it." "But why would anyone tamper with it?" Mr. Howard asked. He got a magnifying glass and studied the statue. Finally, he admitted that Nancy's suspicion might be right. With a thin, knife-like instrument, he deepened the crack a tiny bit. The next second, the figurine fell apart in his hands. "Well, for Pete's sake!" Mr. Howard exclaimed, thunderstruck at how easily the piece had broken open. "I wonder if the rest of the shipment has similar cracks." He dashed to the rear of his shop, where 5 other statuettes were standing on a shelf. Nancy followed him and watched as he examined each one. "Every figurine has the same flaw," the jeweler announced. "Well, I'm certainly going to find out about this." He picked up the telephone. "I'll call the company from whom I bought these." Mr. Howard gave the operator a New York City number and soon was connected with the wholesale house. As Nancy watched, a look of amazement crossed the man's face. Then he became pale. Finally, he said, "You say you don't have a salesman named Wart working for you? But he showed me his business card." Nancy knew before Mr. Howard concluded his call that he must have been cheated by an impostor. "What am I going to do?" he cried despairingly as he hung up. The young sleuth expressed her sympathy and said she was afraid there was nothing he could do. "What did the man look like?" she asked. Mr. Howard said the salesman was about 5'8", had graying hair, and at the time of his call wore a light gray suit. He was pallid and had deep-set eyes that kept darting around nervously. "But he seemed like a nice fellow, and certainly was a good salesman," the jeweler added. And Mr. Wart had an accent. He dropped French and German phrases into his conversation and talked about imported figurines like a foreign art dealer. Nancy advised Mr. Howard to notify the police. Then she asked to examine the figurines herself. "I suspect that there may be some other reason for these flaws than just poor workmanship," she said. On a sudden hunch, she added, "Would you sell these to me at a reasonable price?" Though Mr. Howard was puzzled by Nancy's request, he said that she could have the whole lot for $5. "Fine," she said. "And now, Mr. Howard, will you please take these figurines apart for me?" "Yes," he replied. "But would you mind telling me what you have in mind?" "I think that we may find something inside," said Nancy. "Mr. Wart, for some reason, probably wanted to get rid of these figurines in a hurry. The answer may be right inside these statuettes." Mr. Howard brought out several tools and halved the first figurine. "Nothing in here." The next 3 bisque dancing girls contained no clue. As Mr. Howard began work on the last one, Nancy watched eagerly. As it came apart, both of them gasped in amazement. Inside lay a small piece of paper with a number on it. 10561 B24. End of chapter 2.